Good. Welcome to Bookfest 2016 East Hampton. Thank you. You can clap now. Just a few things. This wouldn't be happening without the lovely folks at East Hampton City Arts Plus. We get money from the Massachusetts Cultural Council, so thank you for money. Just a little bit of housekeeping about today's debate about Iggy Pop. We've got Steve Waxman and Chris O'Leary. Both are very smart people, but I'm going to ask them to be respectful of each other as we go into this as much as possible. We're each going to have several minutes to wax and wane philosophically about the subjects at hand. Keep it above the belt as much as possible. Audience, laugh when appropriate. Clap when there's the right moment to do so. Try and watch it. No bum rushing the stage. There will be some music that's happening after the panel. Please stick around. Also, there are books for sale. Both Steve and Chris are authors, also known as writers, and they're gonna have books for sale back there, and so you should totally buy their books. I know that they're back there. They're back there so that it doesn't get crazy over here, and anyhow. But you should totally buy their books because it's good to buy books. It's fucking Bookfest. So let's get this together. So we are going to first start off by watching something from 1970, live in Cincinnati.
Till the flow, hey, word. I feel alright. I feel alright. Are you alright? There they are. That's peanut butter.
Here's peanut butter, right? I mean, the peanut butter is like the coup de grace. It's big peanut butter, yeah. But what other rock star is going to spread peanut butter on his body in the middle of a concert in 1970? Maybe Alice Cooper, who has a pie thrown in his face at the same show, right? Which Lester Bangs writes about. It's like Alice Cooper and Lester Bangs are these two weird parallel figures who are both completely willing to self-efface their own star power. And that's why I think this matters as much as it does.
One thing we're going to talk about a little bit later is Iggy's relative obscurity in a way. And this is the only footage, I think, of him with the Stooges video. And this is pretty much the only way you would have seen him if you didn't see him on tour. Turning on randomly, it's like a show that was kind of picked for no reason. Because it was just that's whatever's showing. It wasn't like we're going to show the Stooges. It was more like
they got their prime time moment. Yeah. For some reason, this festival became a TV special.
Yeah, so it's kind of random why he's even. But this is it. This is sort of in the way that Iggy is kind of a legendary figure. In a way, derives from I think third-hand recollections of seeing the show on TV. Like, oh my God, It's the guy with no shirt who rubs peanut butter all over himself and cuts himself. And so that's kind of, I think, why it's important too. I think it's sort of the central image people still have of them. If you think of Iggy Pop, you think of a figure like that often. Shirtless is key. But also, it's violent in a weird, kind of a loving way, and it's just like a feral boy. There's a great quote about how Iggy said, basically, when I go on stage, I channel being 1 or 2 years old. And now I'm more mature, so I channel being 6 or 7 years old. And that's kind of what he is. He's kind of this giant id on stage with nothing holding him back. So I think it's funny.
He's also got a dog collar on,
Yes.
which you can't really see.
And silver gloves.
Yeah.
Silver gloves, yeah.
So,
Well, this whole idea of this lovable violence, I'm wondering in terms of him being under the punk. I don't know why I just did that. But under the punk kind of framework,
yeah.
and him being called that at this time as well. What do you think about that and that kind of definition starting to percolate at that time?
Well, punk is barely percolating at that time, right? I mean, I think that's really important to note. Like, punk as we know it is much more of a 76, 77
Yep.
and forward kind of phenomenon. To the extent that punk is on anyone's radar at this time, it usually refers to stuff from the 60s. And it's like garage rock is called proto-punk or punk, but it's like a whole other thing. And, you know, when bands like the Stooges and the MC5, who were their like Detroit Brethren, and some other early 70s bands who were starting to carve out a new sonic niche in hard rock, emerge, gradually this term punk starts to get applied to them, but nobody's really sure how to apply it or how to define it. I think as it becomes defined, it becomes increasingly clear that Iggy is whatever it is. But I would also say, and I'll maybe develop this more as the conversation goes on, this is very much proto-punk. It's not punk proper. And my take on Iggy is that he's proto-punk and he's post-punk, but he never was really punk. Like, he perceives punk, and by the time punk comes along, he's already kind of moved somewhere else. So I think this is the ultimate proto-punk.
What do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree?
I agree.
Who are you voting for?
I think that much of the first wave of British punk is people trying to imitate Iggy Pop or the Stooges. It's literally the Damned had a song called "Feel All Right," which is 1969, I think, under a different name. And when Iggy finally tours England with Bowie, as in a clip we'll see later, it's like a religious pilgrimage for all the punks that come backstage and meet him, the Buzzcocks and Steve Jones and what have you. And he was sort of flattered, but also kind of irritated by these people who were kind of doing, as Steve said, his old music, because in 76, 77, he's doing odder, more kind of industrial noise stuff. And it kind of felt like, you know, maybe what John Lennon would have thought of, you know, the same people doing Beatles-esque songs in 1975, 1976. A little old hat, nice, but also it fueled his competitive edge. And that's the Lust for Life album is sort of him trying to stake a claim like as the original, basically.
Oh, but we were talking about how his albums were very hard to get. And we were talking about how, like, you didn't actually get an album or did you get a cassette first?
No.
No, it was an album,
It was
but like you
already
get
a
it to like the
CD,
90s or something like that?
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. So he was kind of this known, talked about person, but being able to actually get your hands on material was difficult.
Well, at least the material you wanted to get.
Yes, you could
Like,
get
you could buy Zombie Birdhouse or something
yeah,
like
for
that.
$2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted that.
But the Stooges records in particular were like,
Right.
no one actually owned those albums, I think, of our generation. We're roughly the same age.
Yeah, I don't
I had a
remember.
Stooges album when I was 17 in 1983.
Well, you were
Well, you were ahead of us.
You were Canadian.
I were in the cutout band. I once went in a cutout band and there was Lust for Life, Kills, all of them. I was like the treasure trove. But
That was the greatest record
I
they've
just
ever
want
done.
to disagree because I could get those records then. It wasn't you couldn't get them if you didn't
Well, you had to pay like $30 or $40.
Not in suburban Southern California. All right. My shitty little record store in the mini mall near my
Yes.
where I grew up.
Yeah.
Connecticut
Did not
never
carry
did.
Stooges albums. I read about them. I knew who they were. They
This
were
is interesting though. Hold on. California, Connecticut, you couldn't.
But
But Canada,
Canada was
you
a,
could.
was a free,
But wait, they're all.
free zone.
I'm just kind of seeing that they're all C's. They all begin with C, and I think that means
About
something.
the Stooges, because Cream magazine was national, and so we would talk about that scene out there, and people didn't know about Alice Cooper, who Zappa found, and all that. But it was like this Midwestern thing that we didn't know anything about.
Yeah.
I do want to, since the audience is already getting involved, I did want to just
He's
read
right though. His
one
reading matters.
thing about there's somebody named Jerry Leclerc who posted on Facebook, and I just wanted to share this with you. Say no thank you, we live in Westfield. So I just wanted you to, Jerry's not here, and he wanted me to make you aware of this and say no thank you to this whole conversation.
That was important.
He thinks this shouldn't be happening, especially near Westfield, which we are. Continue.
What were you
Well,
saying? You were saying Cream magazine
let's
was
go to Cream.
Cream,
Let's
go to
talk
Cream
about
magazine,
Cream for a bit.
Cream.
Yeah.
Go to
No,
Cream.
because I think this is actually really, I mean, you're absolutely right about the importance of Cream. And part of the importance of Cream is, it's twofold. A, it was a Detroit-based publication. It was national, but it's rooted in Detroit. The Stooges come out of Ann Arbor, which is not Detroit, but the whole Michigan scene was pretty well integrated for a time in the late 60s, early 70s. And it was a scene that was like a little laboratory of inventive and experimental hard rock. There were so many great bands. It was John Sinclair's scene, right? He was the MC5 guy. He was the manager of the Five. He had an affiliation with the Stooges, but the Stooges were their own thing, right? They were autonomous. And he didn't have much of a controlling interest in Cream. Cream was more like these other younger rock critics, Dave Marsh, Lester Bangs, Ben Edmonds. And the other thing about the Stooges, which I think relates to how hard their music was to get, but at the same time how even when you couldn't get their stuff, you knew who they were. They were a critics band. Like, these guys never sold shit for albums, right? But people who were into rock knew the Stooges, and they knew the Stooges because they were written about way more than they were played on the radio. And that makes for a certain kind of cachet. It makes for a band who is a complete abject failure in their lifetime, and yet when they reunite, they start to play giant venues. And that's what we've seen, I think, in recent years.
It's kind of like Pearl Jam.
Yeah, or the Pixies.
Right.
yes.
Chris, what do you think about this whole thing? What do you think about them being from Ann Arbor, especially? Does
I
that
think-
have any,
Yeah, I mean,
Because, I think most people would say Detroit, but
I think
they're wrong.
that's an important distinction because Iggy starts out in garage bands. His name comes from the band he was in, the Iguanas, because he was ridiculed by he realized that the future was sort of the university radicals. That's kind of what was getting national attention. They were being stuck in the frat circuit, playing Louie Louie over and over again wasn't for him. And so when he joins a band called the Prime Movers, who are, I think, all University of Michigan guys, they start teasing him and calling him Iguana, because like dirtbag. Hey, Iguana. He was a drummer also, which sometimes gets belittled just by being a drummer. Yeah. But Iggy realized that this was kind of the scene that he wanted to be part of and kind of take things from. And the Stooges begin as, would you call it like a free jazz band almost, or a noise band?
Noise.
They're not jazz, but they're playing vacuum cleaners, they're playing ukuleles tuned to one note, blenders, right? Something maybe.
Sounds about right.
So I think that's important. I think that they're not quite a people's band, even though they were all working class for the most part. They had that connection to the MC5 and the Sinclair crowd, which maybe wouldn't have happened if they were from Cincinnati or something, or maybe a place without a radical scene in the 60s.
Well, it also might have not have happened the same way if they were from New York and LA, where I think there was more segregation of scenes. You know, like in New York, there's the free jazz scene and the loft jazz scene, and then there's the rock scene, and there's all these scenes, but they don't always like intersect. And something about the Detroit scene, and John Sinclair had a lot to do with this. He was himself a conduit for certain things coming together. He was like a political activist, he was also a journalist, he was also a band manager, who was like staging shows by people like Sun Ra, and then at the same time he met up with the MC5 and he starts taking an interest in the rock scene, and he's like playing these like 20-year-old hard rock guys like Sun Ra and Ornette Coleman albums, and they get into it, and then they decide to try to play rock that kind of sounds like that. And it becomes a very distinct kind of regional variation on something that isn't like happening the same way anywhere else. And the Stooges were very much shaped by that. And it, you know, and Iggy himself, I think this is really crucial too. You know, he's got this, as Chris was describing before, the spiritual child kind of thing going on. But he's also the son of a school teacher.
Yeah.
And he is growing up around Ann Arbor and the University of Michigan. And he's soaking a lot of intellectual influences up that I think sometimes get lost in the way his story is told, but they're crucial. So the avant-garde stuff that's in the Stooges sound isn't just there by accident. It isn't just there because these like dopey guys decided that it was fun to influence. Like he actually had an intentionality about that was pretty crucial.
I'm done.
Very good. Very good. I wanted to move on to Iggy's body,
Yes.
and just in general.
Favorite thing.
Just in general. I mean, the postures he held, the way he put himself out there, as well as his hair, which is kind of stringy. But what do you think about that? I mean, one of the things is just he's very sinewy. And I wonder what your thoughts are on his body in general. You can talk about his body in any way, shape, or form because we are here.
Well, as I was saying to Steve, that Iggy may be the only rock guy whose autobiography has a full frontal nude photograph of him in it. And
The only old person we all want to fuck.
yes, there you go. And to bring that.
You want to watch him first.
I'm not even going to clarify.
And I think when Iggy, his trademark is, you know, say Bowie has Ziggy Stardust or something, or other people have different, you know, capes or what have you. That's sort of his thing, is being incredibly ripped and shirtless, and looking like he has not an ounce of fat on his body at age 65 or something. That's kind of his like, you know, when he dies, the obituary may have a shirtless picture of him.
A shirtless corpse. Well, and I think along with him being ripped and all of that, right, which is certainly part of it. But to me, when I think of the way he uses his body, it's about the risks he takes. I mean, it's jumping into a crowd of 50,000 people, and who the fuck knows what's going to happen when you do that, you know? But it's also, I mean, some of the most fabled things that surround him are these acts of self-destruction, right?
Yeah.
And many of them happen on stage. So, you know, famously he plays like Max's Kansas City in around, I think it's in 1970, and he maybe accidentally, maybe not, like falls. I mean, I think he falls accidentally, but he cuts himself badly, bleeding all down his chest. And he just keeps playing, and he's like, there's blood everywhere. He literally needed to be hospitalized. And he was as soon as the show was over. He plays like 7 songs, bleeding profusely. And even, I was rereading his biography today to kind of have some stuff in it. That's Iggy. And he was talking about how, like, he remembered he was bleeding on the stage, and he even noticed that, like, if he moved his body in a certain way, the blood would spurt. Seriously.
Yeah.
Like, and so he did that, right? Because he's like, that's kind of cool. Get people are freaked out, and at the same time, they're completely mystified that this guy is so into what he's doing that he's going to just bleed all over himself and everybody else in order to just get his point across, whatever the hell that is. That, to me, is Iggy's body. Like, is the significance of his body. He uses his body the way that performance artists use their bodies. Like, and it's another way in which I think he's like undermining and affirming his sort of role at the center of everyone's attention at the same time. Like, I'm here to hurt myself, and you're going to watch me hurt myself, and what does that make you? You know, I think that was one of the ways in which he confronted the people who were like his audience.
Well, that goes to that aspect that we were talking about the audience is not your friend.
Yes.
So what is that? But there's a relationship. He still has this lovable
I disagree
quality.
I disagree with that.
Well,
I'm con.
you're con?
I'm against what you just said.
Wait, what's
because
con?
he's not saying that he's against the audience. What he's saying is he's in the moment. If something happens that's personally dangerous or dangerous to someone else, he's not going to judge it. He's going to be in the moment. That's
Right, but you're not on the panel.
That's a cons. Lock that con.
That's like pausing Star Trek. Okay, go ahead.
What was
The audience is not your friend.
Well, I
the
think-
body, the kind of interplay between.
I think it was, you know, when you go to an Iggy Pop concert, he doesn't want you sitting there, you know, just staring at him blankly. He wants to provoke a reaction in you, whether it's disgust at, oh my God, this guy's bleeding, he's got peanut butter everywhere, or just that you're caught up in being kind of scared of what he's going to do. You don't know what he's going to do next. And it continues well. It's well beyond the Stooges. There's a great story about in the early 2000s. He was in Dublin, and I don't know if anybody here knows the Irish band, the Kurds. I think they're the Kurds. They're sort of they were very popular and sort of the equivalent of, I don't know, of a singing brother and sister act. And they go to a show, and they're sitting in a luxury booth watching him, and I guess they're eating and on their phones, and he gets progressively angrier and angrier, and finally he starts spitting at them, and he throws his mic at them. This is like Irish pop royalty. And this is 2002, and he's well past 50. So I feel like that's kind of a core with him. Like, you don't eat and talk to your friends during the Iggy Pop show. You can boo me, and you can say you suck, and we're going to hear that later, him baiting an audience, because that's what he loved to do. He would like to go to biker bars. And
Yeah, we should.
should we hear that?
Yeah, let's do Cock in My Pocket.
1, 2, fuck you, pricks! I got my cock in my pocket and I'm sleeping down the old highway. I got my cock in my pocket and I'm sleeping down the old highway. Gonna whip it on your honey, it's your blood today. Whip it on your honey, it's a fine away. My cock in my pocket and it's shoving up. And my cock in my pocket and it's shoving up. Well, I just don't wanna fuck one no man. I just wanna fuck no romance. Oh no! I got my cock in my pocket. I want my baby I'm breathing down the road highway. Oh! Put it on the honey, take your blood today. Put it on the honey, no I can't away. Oh no!
So this is from the infamous Stooges album, Metallic KO. And this is the last Stooges concert that ever happened. Iggy, like 2 days before this show, had played a gig where a biker gang called the Scorpions had been in mass in attendance at the show, harassing him the whole time. And he was doing this thing that Chris was just describing, where he's just like mixing it up with the audience. And one of the biker dudes, who was giant, just like bashed him in the face and knocked him out cold. And the band was very shaken by this. So 2 days later, the band has another gig coming up, which would be this gig, which was their last gig ever. And Iggy's like, "Oh, you Scorpions motherfuckers, come to the gig and I'll kick your asses," right? They don't actually come, I think, but all these other people come and they're just ready to like tear shit up. So this is like one of the most remarkable documents, because you hear Iggy in full force. He is being under siege. Like, the audience is attacking him. They're throwing bottles, they're throwing light bulbs, they're throwing food, they're throwing eggs, and he's just rejoindering the whole time and antagonizing them the whole time. Right? He's not telling them to stop. He's telling them to keep bringing it on, because he's not going anywhere. So, let's listen.
I'll be over soon. Oh. I won't fuck you when I'm working.
We don't know who said that.
Anybody with any more ice cubes, jelly beans, grenades, eggs they want to throw at the stage? Come on. You paid your money, so you take your choice, you know. When they threw eggs, you always say they threw me. Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a big hand for Mr. James Williamson on guitar right here. Rock action on drums. Ronald Frank Ashton on bass. Big hand for Mr. Scotty Thurston on piano, vocal and harmonica. And let's not forget your favorite well-mannered boy, the singer. Let's hear it for the singer. I am the greatest. Thanks for the egg. Thank you for the egg. Do we have any more eggs? More eggs. Who wants this genuine cocktail? You want that or not? What am I being for dozen eggs? Oh, you missed. Come on, try it again. Come on. Listen, I can act my better than you. Come on now. Is it time for Riot Girls? Riot!
Riot Girl starts here.
Get a top of the egg yolk.
You don't have to play it all the way through.
was.
There is the great part where he threatens that he's going to play a 55-minute version of Louie Louie.
Where is that at?
It's at the very end, I think.
Light bulbs too?
You probably
Let's give them an extra treat. Would you rather we just ran through our program set and looked real slick, or would you rather we just relaxed and did Louie Louie?
It's not the 55-minute part, but it gets the point across.
So I mean, and he was not willing. This is who he was. This is what he did. He just antagonized, but people loved it.
Some,
And some did.
indeed. And that's why they I mean, right, how do you split the difference? But I think, to add to Chris's story that he was telling before we went into that clip, I saw the Stooges play 6 years ago, maybe. And at that show, what Iggy did, one of the things he did, was he invited anyone who wanted to come up on stage to just come up on stage. And it was kind of remarkable. About 100 people decided to go up on stage and join him. I've never seen that many people go up on
Did you?
No. I'm a wuss. But a lot of other people did. This was at the House of Blues in Boston. And it's sort of the flip side of that antagonism, which is, and I think it's why, like, the gentleman at the bar is right to say it's not all antagonism. It's not all the audience is not your friend. That he wants oneness, but when the audience isn't giving him what he thinks it should, he will fuck with them. And he will try to get them engaged. And he will do so by any means necessary. Sometimes that means using violence on himself. Sometimes it means turning it outward towards them. But I think the ultimate goal is maximum engagement more than anything. At least in the best case scenario.
Chris?
I think that summed it up. I mean, and that's sort of I think that's one reason he becomes a bit of by the mid-70s, a pariah in the music industry. He gets made fun of a lot by, I think Lou Reed calls him stupid and Lester Bangs, and Ian Hunter really disses him. And he's sort of considered just a disaster as an artist. His records don't sell, and he's at one point basically homeless, kind of bumming off people living on couches in LA. And I think there's that element that he kind of needs that in a way. I mean, he likes success, he likes being a rock star and comfortable, but it also, the engagement with the audience and the desire to keep provoking people and to keep trying to do something different is kind of paramount for him. Ahead of instead of doing some kind of industry hack album, which kind of happens finally, you'd say in the late 80s maybe. He starts doing some mediocre work, but until then.
And what, in terms of the mediocre work, why do you think he went in that direction? Are we talking about that video?
Your favorite
My favorite
song?
Candy?
I don't think that's mediocre as much as he had reached a point where he really, we'll get to this when we get to the Bowie stuff, he really did kind of want to start making some money, and he really did want to be, enough of the success he didn't have to keep playing these crummy clubs, 50 weeks a year. There's an interview with him, 83, 84, at the height of MTV, where he's like in some squalid hotel room somewhere like in Scranton, Pennsylvania, complaining about all these, people on MTV, and he's still scrounging to play these like third-rate gigs. And I think that wore on him, and so he's more willing to be, to play the
To do this.
This is Candy.
This is
It's a rainy afternoon, 1990. In a big city. Jeez, it's been 20 years. Candy. You were so fine. Beautiful, beautiful girl with a flickering torch. I had a dream that no one else could see. You gave me love for free. Candy, 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 I can't let you go. All my life you're haunting me. I loved you so. Candy, 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 I can't let you go. Life is crazy. Candy, baby.
Yeah, well, it hurt me real bad when you left. Hell, I'm glad you got out, but I miss you. I've had a hole in my heart for so long. I've learned to fake it and just smile along. Down on the street, the smell are all the same. I need love, not games, not games. Candy, 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 I can't let you go.
All my life you're haunting me. I love you so. Candy, 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 I can't let you go. Life is crazy. I know, baby. Candy, baby. Candy, 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 I can't let you go. All my life you're haunting me. I love you so. Candy, 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 life is crazy. Candy, baby. Candy, 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 I can't let you go. All my life I'm waiting for you, and so. Candy, 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 I can't let you go.
Well, I mean, the thing for me at the age that I was when this came out is I didn't know who he was.
Yes.
And I wondered why the redheaded woman with the beehive from the B-52s was collaborating with this guy who didn't wear a shirt. And so I wondered, like, what, you know, so and then finding out who he was later is kind of like, oh, this is kind of interesting, you know?
Well,
Not
I
like
think
the
we're gonna-
B-52s were veering so far away
Right.
from where they started to do, you know, for her to go in this direction, but for him, it was pretty, this is much more, especially with kind of when we were talking about kind of some Bowie mixed and master stuff versus the Iggy Pop stuff. I mean, this is very slick.
I think if we're going to talk about Iggy's career choices, there's two things you've got to bring up. One is decades of failure leads people to make desperate choices over time. The other is severe drug use hampers and impairs one's judgment. And, I mean, you can't underestimate either of those. And the two together, I think had a lot to do with the trajectory of his career. You know, I mean, rereading back through. So for folks who want to really get the full story and who don't know it already, I mean, you can buy my book, which has a good chapter on Iggy. But if you want really like the thorough story, Paul Trinka, Open Up and Bleed, is a great biography of Iggy Pop. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I highly recommend it.
It's even better as an audiobook.
Yeah.
I couldn't say it, but I'll
It's really good to go to sleep to.
Awesome. Is that an endorsement?
Sure.
Okay. But it's harrowing reading that book because you see, like, every time that Iggy seemed like he was poised for something good to happen, he sort of figured out a way to make it not happen. And usually it was by going on a total drug binge. You know, sometimes it was coke, sometimes it was heroin, often it was a mix. But he snatched defeat from the jaws of victory time and time again. And so by the time he gets to the mid-90s and he's doing stuff like Candy, you know, it's sort of like, why not, right? Like, why not sell out? Because nothing else has worked for him at that point. You know, he's been true to himself over and over and over again. And he hasn't really gotten him anywhere except for cult status and that dollar gets you a cup of coffee.
Doesn't pay the rent.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know where we are in the.
We're all over the place. It doesn't even fucking matter.
But obviously, Bowie is the template for it in a way. He saw what, Bowie basically doing the same thing in '83 with Let's Dance, which basically supported him. China Girl basically funds Iggy Pop's life. And realizing, like, well, David did it, and he seems okay with it, so.
And that was the thing around, we were talking about how Bowie became his benefactor and the relationship. So could you talk more about that relationship that they had together?
This is you, man.
Oh, it's me.
You're the Bowie person.
Yeah.
Chris's book on Bowie is for sale in the back.
Indeed.
Thank you. It's Bowie first encountered Iggy a year after the Cincinnati thing we saw at the beginning. And one thing to remember about Bowie is that, like a lot of British people, I'm generalizing here, but I've met some British people, and it's all true.
Everything you've
ever met. Consider Americans to be slightly barbaric in ways, and that Iggy Pop was Bowie's idea of what Americans were like. He was like Natty Bumppo from James Fenimore Cooper novels. He was this absolutely crazy wild man who seemed to have come out of a garbage dump and didn't, bathe once a week and probably lived on eggshells or something. And that was kind of the fantasy he had of him, probably because of hearing or seeing clips like the Cincinnati thing. And so, and Bowie already had this love of American eccentrics. He loved people like, mainly the legendary Space Cowboy, Stardust Cowboy, who was this kind of outsider artist, shambling guy. So Iggy fit in very
Wayne
much. Wayne County, Zappa, he was a big Zappa fan, that sort of thing. And so Iggy totally fit in with his ideal of like what a crazy American rock star was. And also Bowie was that very shy person, and he kind of created these stage personas in a way to get over that. I'm not going to go on stage. Ziggy Stardust would go on stage for me. Then Mike Duke would go on stage for me. And he never really liked performing. Whereas he saw Iggy as somebody who would seem to be natural. Iggy would be sitting backstage reading a newspaper, and then he'd be like, "Oh, I'm on," and he would just run on stage and rip his shirt off and roll around. It seemed like he could do it without breaking a sweat. So that fascinated him too. And so the first encounter is basically, 1973, he agrees, or 72, I think the sessions are, he agrees to produce Raw Power, the last Stooges album. And did it in, Bowie's story was that he got or I think it was just a mix-it, not more than mix-it. Bowie's story is he got it and it was 2 tracks. It was Iggy's voice on 1 and everything else on 2. And he had to somehow salvage the album. And it was controversial. It took decades of people complaining about Bowie's mix. Sucked first, and then Iggy did his own mix, I think, in the late 90s. But basically, Bowie saw Iggy as a rehabilitation project and sort of a guinea pig also. he was going to help Iggy get a career, but he also was going to use Iggy to do things that he didn't want. He was afraid were a little too much for his image at the time. So that's when you get the album The Idiot, which is basically, Iggy is completely at loose ends. He has no record contract. And Bowie is also completely out of his mind on cocaine also. So the two of them are kind of at the same position, but basically Bowie agrees to produce Iggy's first solo album with the caveat that they're going to do strange stuff on it. They're going to experiment with drum sounds and distortion, and Iggy was more than willing to be, as he said, a guinea pig. And so what happens is that Bowie tries to commercially give him a record contract, give him a kind of a commercial presence by his trademark. It's Iggy Pop, presented by David Bowie almost, And it continues as the clip we'll see, not that clip, but the dinosaur one. Bowie actually goes on tour with him, and he doesn't sing, he's just the piano guy. And he refuses to do interviews. People want to come and interview him. He's like, no, it's talk to this guy. And so, should we play?
Tell us why why you made us watch that.
You can start.
Okay. Everything's it's Dinah Shore. And so
Daytime TV.
Daytime, my grandmother was watching that in 1977. It's like, oh my God, what's wrong with that young man on television? And it's just great how even like there's like a potted fern in the middle of it, and there's this kind of squalid 70s lighting. It still looks a little, when going towards the camera, you're like, is he going to hit the camera? Has they blocked this out properly? So it's a great example of how even in that sort of mainstream venue can just kind of still be kind of out there.
And I think it epitomizes how weirdly he was always positioned, right? Like, what the fuck is he doing on Dinah Shore? Right? How is that guy on Dinah Shore? And it's really hard to find the interview footage from that same episode, right? But after this, he like sits and gets interviewed by Dinah Shore, right? And Iggy being interviewed is always amazing because you suddenly see the duality in his character in a way you don't when he's on stage, which is, here's this guy who can be like the most aggressive, feral kind of figure when he's up on stage, and yet you get him in a conversation and suddenly he's like the most lucid and self-effacing and charismatic and engaging figure you would ever want to meet. And you kind of get the sense that this is partly a sign of his brilliance and complexity, and it's also probably a mark of his being a little bit of a sociopath, right? Because, no, seriously, if you've ever, I mean, I've known a couple, right? If you've ever known a sociopath, like, they're really good at ingratiating themselves. That's part of how they like getting your good graces, and then they take advantage of you. And you read stories of Iggy's life during the 70s, and this was his pattern. Like, Iggy Pop shows up on someone's doorstep looking like he just pulled himself out of hell. You know, he's been on a drug binge for 5 days. He hasn't taken a bath. He's like, hi, can I have a shower? You know, so B.B. Buell, for instance, who was Todd Rundgren's girlfriend, lets him into the house. He takes a shower. Next thing she knows, he's lying in her bed. And he's like, hey, let's hang out. And next thing you know, B.B. Buell is having an affair with Iggy Pop, and Todd Rundgren gets all mad. And it all starts because Iggy Pop shows up on her doorstep, being all like, I need help. And she's like, you're cute, sure. And you kind of see the same thing going on in Iggy Pop talking with Dinah Shore. It's like, oh, wow. Totally. Yeah.
Do we actually have?
There's a very, very little clip here.
Okay.
Yeah.
You guys want to watch it?
Yeah.
Iggy Pop is considered to be the originator of what is called punk rock today.
The proto-punk took his R-rated act to Dinah Shore's G-rated show. But instead of the usual talk show chit-chat, Iggy shocked Dinah and housewives across America with stories about his notorious past.
You were doing things to yourself physically that were...
Yeah, and to other people, too.
But you cut yourself with a bottle.
Yeah, well, that was because I'd done something really foolish the night before, and I was ashamed. And I felt so bad that I thought, the heck with it, and I grabbed a glass and
Oh, Jim.
But that was, well, I've had treatment for that sort of thing, since. Yeah, helped a lot.
So there's an innocence in that too, just kind of like, well, you know, I mean, it didn't really, just kind of, you know.
But, you know, can we also watch that little bit of the Tom Snyder thing? Because I think that's really appropriate here, too. So, I mean, Iggy interviewed, it really is like a whole different Iggy.
It's up a little, yeah. Number 10.
There we go.
So, yeah, scroll to about 15:45. There you go.
This thing where you throw up on the audience and make yourself bleed and roll on glass.
Water? Ah, here we go. Sorry.
Do you do that?
What, did I ever?
Yeah.
Yes.
Why?
Well,
See how quiet they are, they want to hear.
the first time I ever did it was out of frustration. I just felt very bad at the time, and music is an expressive medium that sometimes it can get out of hand, you know, and suddenly maybe you'll be playing a tune and you really want to express the truth. And the truth at that moment was that I ought to be cut. So I cut myself, you know.
You see, that scares some people.
Well, that was a long time ago, man.
Okay, no.
I know. What were you doing that year, you know?
I don't know.
70s?
What year did you do it?
73. I think you were just starting to cover really interesting news events for a LA show. Is
That's
that right?
right, that's correct.
About that year, so
Why shouldn't people be frightened by this music?
Well, I didn't. No, that's not.
You know, like you said,
that's not nothing to do with the music. That's just something I did once. You know?
Okay, but there are some people who,
I had problems. I hope to hell that somebody in the record business and the movie business, who wants to watch someone with some real talent and something to say, well, forgive me for my problems formerly,
So that's what you were talking about before, where he could be this crazy person on stage and then go in this direction.
And now he's like basically summarizing Nietzsche's version of aesthetics, right? Probably, and this is, you imagine like Iggy and David Bowie, this is what they would talk about.
I think so.
Right?
Yeah.
And snorting lines of coke and
Starsky
talking
and
about
Hutch.
Yeah.
Starsky and Hutch fans too.
Oh, they like Starsky and Hutch.
It was the 70s. So, yeah, I mean, I think that perfectly encapsulates how Iggy, and he's got the missing, everything about his persona here, I think, is almost like in a nutshell. This guy who brutalizes himself and yet has this intellectual approach to what he does that somehow underlies a lot of the way he approaches his art, even when it's at its most primitive.
Do you agree with that sentiment?
I do, yes. The thing about there's a great line about how when he's doing the song for 10 minutes, he can't talk articulately. Makes a lot of sense because, to Steve's point of the sociopathy, it does feel like there almost are two versions of Iggy Pop that phase in and out of reality. And when he goes into the stage Iggy Pop, it takes a while to kind of get deep, unpossessed from that.
And we haven't actually talked about his name.
Yeah. Right. We talked about Iggy, but we haven't
part.
talked about Pop yet.
Yeah.
And I have that right.
That's on the sheet, isn't it?
Good.
Well, it's weird because, again, the biography account of his name is like about as mundane as you could imagine. Supposedly, first he's like appearing with the Stooges as Iggy's stooge, right? And he's not necessarily known as Iggy Pop. And the pop part comes in, and you think, like, pop, it's got to be ironic, right? This guy's like the least pop thing ever. But according to the story, there was some guy they knew named Pop. Like, his last name was Pop. I don't know if this is true, but this is what they say in the biography, and this is what people, like, members of the Stooges say. And Iggy was, like, trying to emulate this guy or make fun of him at some point, so he shaved off his eyebrows. And then he did that, and they started calling him Pop, because he kind of, like, reminded them of this guy who was some weird character in their neighborhood. And that's where Pop comes from. Like, how random is that, right? But, of course, eventually he grows into the name, and it becomes much more than that. And it does become what seems to be this ironic kind of commentary on, like, pop and yet not pop at all, right? But it also, I think, more to the point, like, as he becomes Iggy Pop, it's just an alter ego. And I think what you hear and see evidence of when you dig into his life story is there really are two.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just a seeming two. Like,
well, his friends all call him Jim, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
everyone
think he's
calls him.
still, like, I've heard stories of people meeting him on the street, and he's like, hi, I'm Jim. Like, Iggy is, like, what he is in this one place. And so, that's not necessarily a sign of a personality disorder or anything, but it's a sign of somebody who negotiates the different sides of himself very complexly, at the very least.
And then the whole pop issue comes up with, again, the later Bowie stuff, which is, in the 80s, partly out of friendship, because he wants Iggy to make some money, but also because he's having a songwriting crisis of sorts, and he's not writing that much. Bowie starts covering a lot of Iggy Pop songs, and it becomes his goal almost to take some really intensely personal and dark Iggy Pop songs and turn them into, in one case, a huge MTV top 5 hit, which is China Girl. China Girl starts out because Iggy Pop is having an affair while making the Idiot album with a Vietnamese woman. So of course Iggy, China, not Vietnamese didn't scan, I guess. But And the frustrations he felt with trying to communicate with this woman, she couldn't speak English, he couldn't speak French, which was the language she was using. So the absolute anger and anguish of being unable to talk to somebody who he was in love with. And it's a very dark and incredibly intense song. There's also the play on China being heroin. He's addicted to her, and that China being fragile. And the whole thing is about how he's such an awful person. He's going to corrupt her, he's going to ruin her, everything good about her, which is a standard Iggy Pop lyric that happens often. Bowie, 7 years later, decides, there's actually a really hummable song in that. I'm going to redo it for my big EMI record. And he decides he's working with Nile Rodgers, the producer, and they're like, and Nile Rodgers says, but the song called China Girl is going to be like Chinese stuff in it. Come on, man. And he takes this incredibly Oriental, yes. And he takes this incredibly personal English song and turns it into this very weirdly ironic and incredibly catchy MTV hit from 1983.
China girl, I feel a wreck without my little China girl. I hear her heart beating loud as thunder, so the stars crashing. I'm a mess without my little China girl.
I was enjoying it.
So I mean, I haven't seen that video in a while,
Yeah.
and that's pretty fucked up.
Yes, it is. But that's
yeah.
Bowie.
So let's talk.
Yeah,
Let's
I
talk
mean,
about it.
it's-
Is this about the same time that Let's Dance came out?
It's the same album.
This is the same album.
Yeah. It's ironic Orientalism. It's ironic racism, and it's. I think people at the time didn't really appreciate it. Bowie obviously is playing with this, but you could see the average Schmo being like, "Yeah, China girl." So, and it's just a weird, but it's basically this is Bowie broadcasting Iggy Pop right into kind of like Dinah Shore, right into MTV, right into mainstream America. People probably didn't know Iggy wrote the song though. I certainly didn't when I was 12.
Yeah, and I think this is the start of another phase of significant collaboration between the two of them, right? I mean, and kind of the last really significant phase of collaboration between them that carried into Bowie's next album, which had a lot more of Iggy's songs on it.
Yeah.
But this was also when Iggy was kind of moving in that weird direction, when he himself is also starting to become more like AOR, mainstream rock. He's no longer so clearly positioned as the renegade outsider that he used to be, partly because that just hasn't been working out for him for so long. But yeah, if this was not a panel about Iggy, I'd have a lot more to say about this, but I feel like because that's a Bowie video, we shouldn't get too caught up in it.
Yeah.
Except just to be like, ew.
Okay. Okay, let's just do some.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, so in terms of kind of 21st century Iggy and the Stooges reunion, and you were talking about this, like how big was this for people in general, or for Iggy himself in terms of this happening again?
I think it was enormous for the Stooges themselves, both for personal reasons. You know, I mean, I don't think they only did it for the money, although I'm sure that had a lot to do with it, but I think they saw something there that was worth reclaiming while they still could. I was just listening to the first album they released after they reunited, which is called The Weirdness. I don't know if people have heard it. It's not good. So, you know, in terms of leaving an addition to the Stooges' legacy in terms of new music that will add to the luster, not so much. But I think what it allowed was, a lot of new fans to get to experience the band's music more directly than they would have had a chance to do. A lot of old fans a chance to experience the music who would not have had the opportunity before, like live at least. And giving them a chance to sort of reconsider what parts of that legacy still mattered the most. And as far as I can tell, it's kind of a tug of war. I mean, we haven't actually had the debate about like what are the parts of this legacy that are most worth holding on to. And I think there's two levels of that. There's like what part of the Stooges legacy, and then there's what part of the larger Iggy legacy. You know, I'll just say from my vantage point, like the thing above all that has always stuck with me most is the Stooges album Funhouse. That for me is the sort of pinnacle album. It is just so primal, and his vocal performance on that album is just got so many dimensions to it. And the guitar sounds are just insane and so deep and rich and distorted, and yeah, it's all encompassing. But there's a whole other kind of Stooges fan for whom like Raw Power is the ultimate album of all time. And I think that played out in the way the Stooges reunion went. Like, it kind of, partly just by circumstance, Ron Ashton died, and James Williamson took over, and then the Raw Power stuff became more central to the reunion, whereas at first it was more the sort of early Stooges, the first two albums Stooges stuff. So I think it's an unresolved part of the legacy. It all is great, but like there's a lot of like fuss over which part is the greater of the great.
Raw Power, Funhouse.
I think Funhouse is better.
That's not good. You're supposed to.
But I think, as you mentioned, the Pixies are a good example of a parallel of a band that, when they reunited, got the acclaim and the audiences they kind of felt they deserved from the beginning. They, the Stooges in particular, no one's throwing bottles at them anymore. Now they're revered classic rock, band, and so part of it I think was a legacy thing. Like, let's go out and finish what we started. I think that was actually a line Williamson said, like, let's complete what we threw away in 1972. And I think that's part of it. And it's worth noting that the current tour Iggy's on, he said in the press that this could be it. I might close up shop. Was the quote. Yeah. And so with Bowie's death, and this, it kind of does feel like maybe this is the end of the whole era. This is the last Iggy tour in the last possibly hour.
Are you going to go see this tour? Either of you?
It's not working out time-wise, but I hope to. It keeps going.
It doesn't seem that way. Tickets are really expensive.
How much are they?
Over $100.
Yeah.
Right?
And Bookfest is free. So
That's
let's give it another hand for ECA Plus for making this happen. Steve Waxman teaches at Smith, so if you want to get a degree, talk to Steve. Chris is at the Writer's Mill, so if you want a quiet place, talk to Chris. So is Morgan. They're both quiet. we're going to get the music started in a couple of minutes. We're going to do a little bit of finagling. There are books for sale. Chris's book is back there, and so is Steve's book. Both very much about the Bowie and the Iggy and the other stuff going on back there. Spend your money wisely instead of drinking yourselves to death. Okay, so no, we're going to have a great time. So please, books are back there, and stick around for some music. Thank you.
Thanks.
See that can, yeah, do you? See that can, yeah, do you? She